Good morning. My name is Adam Krieger, and on behalf of Warren Township Youth and Family Services and the Zacharias Center in Gurnee, we would like to welcome everyone to our presentation today, Diversity Dialogue, moving from cultural competency to cultural humility. We'll get started in just a moment, but I'll go through a few things that we need to touch base on. My name again is Adam Krieger. I'm the Director of Warren Township Youth and Family Services. This workshop will be recorded so that you can review the content or even have members of your team or agency watch it for future discussion. Please use the Q&A for questions for the speakers. With the large number of people attending, we have actually close to 200, the presenters may need to limit or wait on responding to some questions. General comments or sharing of resources, it's best to use the chat. Just to let you know, I sent out this morning copies of the presentation and the agenda. If for any reason you did not receive those, please know that go into the chat section and you'll find a link to our website and you can download the two forms. The workshop will end at 12:15 and somewhere in there we'll take about a 10 or 15 minute break. Upon completion of the workshop, you will be sent an email with a link for a feedback form. If you wish to receive a certificate for your hours or just to show that you attended, you must complete the form. We will list the name on the certificate based on the name you give us on the feedback form. Please know that the name on the feedback form must match the registration information we have on record. The workshop will meet the requirement for social workers for 3 hours of cultural competency. Just to give a brief history of this workshop, we were originally scheduled to present this workshop in April. Due to the quarantine, however, we postponed the workshop and hope to present sometime in the fall. However, with the increased discussion on racial justice, equity, white privilege, and understanding our own hidden biases and how they affect us, we felt it was very important that we put the workshop on as soon as possible. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers and get started. Our first speaker, Valerie Walker, has been active in human services profession since 1985 and currently serves as the Director of Services at Zacharias Sexual Abuse Center. Valerie brings considerable experience in academia, nonprofit leadership, clinical supervision, community organizing to her role. In her counseling, advocacy, and administrative roles, she has worked with persons impacted by poverty, trauma, identity issues, and holistic health challenges. With Valerie, we have Freedom Nguyen. And Freedom has served immigrant and refugee communities for the last 16 years in the context of higher education and community-based programs. He chaired the Diversity and Multicultural Inclusion Committee at Roosevelt University and serves on Harper College's Cultural and Climate Committee. Freedom continues to work as a multicultural educator and currently serves on the board of Code Create, a nonprofit organization providing STEM initiative programming for Chicago urban youth. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand this over to Valerie Walker. And I hope everybody enjoys the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for having us. I'm thrilled to be able to partner with Warren Township Youth Services and with my colleague Freedom. We're going to get started with our introductions and our welcome here. Is everybody able to see this, Freedom, the slides up well? Okay, terrific. Okay. Having a conversation, and I wish that this could be a conversation with 200 people, but having a conversation, having discussion, having learning around the concept of cultural humility, which is not a new term at all. It's new to US culture, really requires us to be authentic and bring our full selves into this time together. So we really want to start by welcoming you, welcoming all of who you are, and hoping that you will bring your best selves here this morning to learn with us and share your own reflections and questions and contributions. And we just have a few things here that we want to address to set up the learning space as much as we possibly can. So as Adam said, the purpose for this time today, moving from cultural competency to cultural humility, really requires for us to see ourselves as safe, creative, innovative spaces in providing care to people we serve, whether it be community members, clients, family members, students. So we really ask you to consider what your purpose is for attending today, what you want to get out of it, and what you will do with it. We have so many opportunities right now. You know, crisis is danger plus opportunity, right? We have so many opportunities right now to look at ourselves as allies and advocates, as healers, as facilitators, as safe spaces for people that we're serving. So I just really want to ask you to reflect on your purpose for being here today and wrapping your minds and hearts around the topic of cultural humility. We also ask for you to make a commitment to participating in this learning space with respect, with listening, with non-judgment. We also want inquiry. We want curiosity. We want to hear your resources and your knowledge. Adam may have said that we will save the chat and compile the resources and questions and reflections that we receive from you and share it back out with you afterwards. So this becomes a community of learners in this space this morning. We want to also ask you to be in the training with us in the best way you know how. If you need to take water breaks, if you need to take face breaks, put your name up. I know that we cannot see all of you, otherwise it would look like a huge party right now. But just to really be here in the way that you know how, and if there are things that we talk about and we're talking about it as a matter of fact and you get some buttons pushed or some feelings triggered, welcome to this work with us. This is not work that we do without those buttons and those opportunities for learning and growth and healing as we journey together in this work towards serving our community. The other piece that I would want to offer is to ask you, if you would, and you absolutely have the choice not to think of somebody in your life. It could be someone who's here or passed on. It could be a client, family member, community member that you would like to bring into your heart and dedicate your energy to this morning as we go through. I know for myself, I've learned and grown so much from the relationships that I've been privileged to have with folks that I'm in service roles to. So I'm going to ask for you to think of somebody in your life and bring that person into your heart to share your energy with through this time today. I also want to now offer Freedom. Do you want to make some comments about any of these as well?
Yes, I think particularly with the technology now and COVID, sometimes our technology can also silence us. And I think it's important for you to be able to know when you're able to step away and give yourself a moment to reflect, given the topics that we'll be discussing. Traditionally, these kinds of discussions and capacity building to discuss about racism or sexism, all of these pieces required typically to be in person. So if there's something that you hear, if there's something that you're reliving or some kind of trauma that comes back into mind, it's okay for you to step away. And it's also okay for you to pose a question and to point out anything that we might be talking about on our chat space. So please feel free to do what you need to do.
Great. I'm gonna take away our photos at this point. That's all right. So the focus of this training with you this morning is to really look at the way that we have moved in our role as practitioners, as case managers, as therapists, as educators, from cultural competency, which has really been offered to us in a developmental way, toward cultural humility, which means with every new relationship, we have an opportunity to begin again in terms of honoring the cultural resources and background and strengths and resiliency factors that folks have in settings where we serve them. So the frame on this training is, are we open to treating others as experts on their own lives? Many of us have the opportunity, the challenge, the additional resources of having our own stories of overcoming, which can certainly contribute to the empathy and ability to connect with others in our community work. Others have a considerable amount of education and training and skill. So we really ask you to bring all of this and to value your experiences, particularly in relationships with folks that you serve, as well as your other educational and skill pathways that you bring. For our plan today, and I'm gonna, Freedom and I will continue to share the space as we go through the slides, but we wanted to share with you and our welcome. Our plan, you also have an agenda that has some more specifics on it, as well as considerable amount of resources at the end that we invite you to take away and share with your teams and colleagues and others who are on this journey with us. But we really want to start by asking some questions from you, and this is an opportunity to also test out our chat in our Zoom here. Freedom?
So some of the reflection questions that we have here, we just wanted you to take a minute to think about. You can also kind of reflect on these throughout the presentation. But for the moment, think about what a core value is that you hold that helps you be present in your work. A cultural identity factor that you would use to describe yourself, a skill that you would use to be effective in your role, and what is a word that you would use to describe your experience with clients. So, you don't have to do all of these. You could pick maybe one to respond to in our chat box. And if you could respond, a core value is, or a cultural identity is, or a skill is. And we would love to see just some of the responses here. Valerie, are you able to see them?
I am not, and I'm wondering if we switch the mode here, if that will help us. Oops.
I see them. If you switch down to all panelists and all attendees, you can see.
Okay.
Every human being has worth in this world. Everyone has strength, a core value. Let's go ahead and come in quickly. Equity, honesty. Every individual has their own perspective, which is very important. Listening. A client has the right to self-determination.
Are there others?
Yes, describe your experience with clients being humble. As an experience has been rewarding, empathy and compassion, and that everyone has value. Thank you so much for your responses. These will be on record, so we will have them documented. Keep them coming if you'd like. Okay. And Valerie, we can go ahead and move to the next slide. So some other questions I'd like for all of you to be able to think about throughout the presentation is kind of our legacies. What kind of world do we want to leave for future generations? And how will we, our generation, will be remembered? During this time when we're working together, there's a group of assumed beliefs that we have, and we want to make sure that those are present, and we're going to be chatting about it. So we all know that we want to serve and do good. So those are some areas that we can tap into to make sure that we can help each other, support each other, and also expand our work. And another part that we want to reflect on is that we are not our ancestors, meaning that we strive to learn from our history, and then also our future is uncertain. So as we try to make our place better for future generations.
So some of the pieces that we think are important as we bring our full selves into this work and the time this morning is really looking at not only what we do and how we do it, because I know many of our organizations and teams are constantly striving to serve better, but why. And so this is an opportunity for parallel process, which is a social work term that really has to do with, how we know ourselves, work on ourselves, learn, develop our skills, has a direct connection to how we can serve other people. So we really want to invite you to center yourself in your own cultural identity, however you define that in this moment, and to ground yourself in your values. We also are going to be using the word roles and resources throughout the time together today, and ask you to challenge yourself in terms of considering different roles that you might play in the lives of clients and community members, from helping, fixing, serving, to facilitating, uplifting, bearing witness. So you'll hear us use some of those resources. There's a concept called the golden circle that you can easily look up additional information on, but it really centers on the why of what we do. And what we know from our work with organizations is when we don't have that sense of purpose in the why, it's very hard for services to be sustainable. It's hard for systems to be sustainable. So we wanted to introduce that at this point as well. Freedom, do you want to add anything to this?
I think that what you've said, it covers all the pieces.
Go ahead,
So,
Freedom.
Just thinking about cultural humility, let's kind of break it down first. If people could respond in the chat boxes, what does it mean to be humble, and why is that important? If you could take a quick minute to respond.
Do you see additional ones coming in?
I do. So some of the responses are respect, serving others, empathy, truly listening, the opposite of arrogance, to be grateful, yes, listening to other perspectives, allow us to hear from our families and to learn from them. Thank you for all your responses. These are very, very important. I think particularly in this kind of environment, there's social capital around being woke and being conscious about the number of issues that are impacting people of color, immigrants. So of course, everybody wants to be able to say, I am this kind of person. I am a person that understands, right? But it becomes social capital. We want to all be able to exchange and talk and have dialogue around that. I think what is particularly important now, and why this is connected to our presentation, is when is it important for me to step up and speak, and when is it important for me to step back and to serve as an ally to be able to listen.
Thank you. We'll keep moving. Yeah. So we mentioned before that we're going to use some different language that will model an approach or a perspective of cultural humility with you. So some of the language here that we will both speak to is the language of unlearning oppression, which is lifelong work, particularly for myself, particularly for so many that have the privilege of living in dominant categories in terms of my cultural identity, being white, being European in my background. We also talk about centering on the lived experiences of others, which is what Freedom mentioned in terms of paying attention to opportunities to step back and support and listen and help move forward folks that usually don't have a voice at the table, whether that's in a workforce, in a work organization, whether it's in somebody with a vulnerability factor such as a disability that might not get seen as having an equal voice. And for many of us, particularly with Zacharias Center and us working with survivors of sexual violence, particularly with a lot of the folks that we work with that are first generation and needing that social capital, needing to know how to navigate resources and services, it's really important for us to center on the lives of others. I talked with Adam yesterday about the importance of, as practitioners, even knowing the residency process for folks that are new to the community, but knowing that we need to really listen and learn from what that family wants, what that individual wants at that time, and not focus on something that we think that they should do. So that's an example of the lived experiences of others. Bearing witness is a phrase that comes from the civil rights movement. It's very different perspective in terms of it really focuses on acceptance, empathy, honoring, validating someone's experience, not analyzing, not interpreting, listening to testimonials, even when they're hard as heck for us to take in and acclimate into our own worldview. I know in my experiences with travel and community practice and living in different types of communities, the really honoring the lived experiences and the stories of overcoming of community members have expanded my worldview and made me able to really connect with and take in these different experiences. And we all have these images. So we're going to spend some time with some stories. Today we're going to talk with you about some research, a lot of our community practice, and again, roles that we can play that really expand beyond our current roles with folks. So I'm going to invite Freedom to add anything if you'd like to here.
Yeah, I think this slide is arranged perfectly because I feel like it's some kind of life order here. But it's important to be able to bring it back down to your roles and understanding that you're not powerless in this moment when you are bearing witness or when you're listening to testimonial, when you're seeing images in your mind or remembering stories from your own past or stories from friends or loved ones. It comes back to your role. Like, how can you help? How can you be an ally or challenge a moment where that might require your assistance, that might require you to be a good listener or to be a good ally.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so here's the fun part. We're gonna share some of these pieces with you. This is not a test or a quiz. These are not requiring definitions, but we really wanna introduce a common language to you that we're going to use throughout the time this morning. So I'll invite Freedom to start, and we're just going to each pick a few of these and speak to them, particularly focusing on ones that might be more misunderstood.
Yeah, if you take a look at this, I'm sure all of you have heard many of these terms, but I think one in particular for me, especially relevant to this training, is privilege. So privilege is kind of an ascribed set of advantages depending on who you are and also context. I want to make clear though that I think privilege is not necessarily a bad thing, especially or particularly if you're using it to help somebody else. So for example, I went to pick up my mom to take her to the grocery store, and she's one, an older individual, and two, also she has glaucoma. And when I pulled into the store parking lot, I park wherever I usually want, but she pulled on my arm and said, "Freedom, can you park a little closer here?" And I was like, "Why?" And she said, "Because I can see better, it's well lit, and I can feel safe." So, as both a healthy individual and as a male, those are two things that I never really thought about. And I think now as I carry on, those are the things that I will always consider when I am picking up my mom or moving forward in our relationship. Valerie, do you want to pick up?
Sure. One piece that I would focus on that I think is relevant to our everyday in terms of our family life and our work life is social determinants of well-being. Okay, so what are the obstacles? What are the resources that impact access to services? So language could be considered a social determinant, transportation, initial health before going through a recovery or a healing process. What we know right now with the combination of the pandemic as well as the racial justice oppression in terms of our increased awareness is that there's a huge inequity in terms of impact on COVID of minoritized populations, particularly the African American community, particularly communities that are working poor or working class. So that's an example of social determinants of well-being. I think it's important, especially for many of us that work with community-based organizations or non-for-profits, to really have an understanding and almost an awe of what it takes for folks to access our services, knowing that pathway is very different for all of us. So I just wanted to pull that out as a way to add context here. You want to choose one, Freedom?
Sure. Bias in service delivery. I'm thinking of a very specific example when I worked for a social service agency in Uptown. We serve a number of different clients, and I was part of a youth program, and we had to take a rotation for the front desk, and there was a manager present at the time. I was doing an intake of a South Asian family that just came in, and this particular family had both turmeric and the strong smell of cumin on their persons. And as the manager kind of pulled me to the side and says, "I can't stand that smell." And at that particular moment, I thought about what that meant in our space. And in that space, our motto was that we should make this a space that's welcoming and that's both also a safe space for every person to come in to receive services. So just that bias, that personal bias, affected how we operated. And that's something that I'm hoping that we can address through our training too, is recognizing our own biases so that we can create a space that's welcoming to everybody.
Thank you for that example, Freedom.
Yeah.
I think another aspect, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that, a part of that tradition of using turmeric was part of their religious ritual and tradition. So that's important to also mention, is recognizing it and respecting where everyone comes from in their own traditions. So that's directly tied to how we're able to effectively serve and operate as case managers, as service providers. Go ahead.
Thank you. No, that was a really important addition to that. With this bias in service delivery sometimes provokes some defensiveness in organizations, but really looks at, on multiple systems level, how we provide accessibility to services, how we provide representation of community members and our staffing and leadership of our organization, and how we create pathways in terms of looking at intake processes, looking at different ways to deliver information. And so there's a lot to learn from this cultural humility standpoint that can affect our organizational decisions as well. The last piece on this that I would pull out is the white supremacy behavior. A lot of times people think white supremacy as protests and KKK and the right, and what's true is, that is all true, and what also is true is that our way of being socialized in the US and centered on white culture, centered on norms around white culture, oftentimes helps us fall short in terms of really fully including and providing equitable opportunities for other people. So when I think about white supremacy behavior, I'm thinking about focus on task over process. I'm thinking about externalizing extroverted communication being the norm. I'm thinking about use of focus on productivity, focus on leadership, focus on climbing up the ladder in organizations. And those are very US-based norms. Also, the use of time impacts our ability to connect with other people. White supremacy behavior means that we do multiple things at one time. We're always multitasking. We're always on to the next job or process or task or project. And in many cultures that our American population comes from, there very much is a focus on relationship over schedule, a focus on spending time in relationships rather than what can I get from this relationship. So there's a lot of wealth in understanding the impact of white supremacy behavior in terms of our abilities to be more inclusive, more equitable in terms of how we treat each other as coworkers, as community members. There's an organization called the Social Justice Training Institute that I would absolutely refer folks to get more information around this area. An organization that I've had the opportunity to learn from as well. So we're not going to cover all of these, but are there any phrases on here that, if you can use the chat box, that you would want us to talk a little bit more about or give examples of? We would invite you to use the chat box at this time.
Valerie, there isn't any now.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll keep moving then.
I'm sorry, microaggression.
Okay. Do you want to start with that?
Internalized oppression as well. Those are two.
Okay.
And cisgender privilege. Okay, they're coming in now. Yeah.
We were going too quick. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. You go ahead, Freedom. Take some and I'll take some others.
Sure. Internalized oppression. So one example for myself is that, you know, as I am a foodie, and I really love food from all different kinds of cultures. And I often prepare food for my daughter to bring to school. But I remember the times when I've been made to feel bad about the things that I ate at the school, from both my teachers and also from other students. So I ended up, for her first year of school, sending peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, when I really wanted to send her with a bowl of rice and mackerel. So I think, in some ways, internalizing who you are, and feeling that you have to adhere or accommodate pieces of who you are, to satisfy the dominant group. That's one example for me. I'm not sure if you wanted to share an example, Valerie.
Sure. When I think of internalized oppression, I think of the experiences of, honestly, kids that I knew growing up that were part of the Guatemalan community, had come up from Guatemala during the wars in the 1980s, and really walked into school systems with this ceiling on their goals, this ceiling on what teachers expected of them. One of the best ways that we can show cultural humility and empowerment in the work that we do is helping people set goals based on their capabilities. That's one of the biggest areas in the helping process, that we can focus on cultural competencies and the goal setting, where we really truly listen to what somebody's capabilities are, what their hopes and dreams are. A lot of the mentoring programs right now, and a lot of the programs like Waukegan to College, for an example, and I know some of the programs you work with, Freedom, really focus on the metas, the setting goals in people's lives so that they can reach higher than the community around them is expecting them to. So I think that's an example of that also.
Yes. Yeah.
What was cisgender privilege is the privilege that goes along with being, having your gender identity be the same as the sex you were assigned at birth. Okay, so I was assigned being female at birth. My gender identity is female. If I was one, like my nephew that was assigned male at birth, but her gender identity is female, that's certainly going to limit privilege in that person's life, limit their ability to be accepted, to be safe in many situations. So there's a lot of new ground right now in terms of really acknowledging and introducing ourselves as our gender identity, to really give visibility to people's lives where they do not have the cisgender privilege, and in those ways, especially for female trans folks of color, puts them in a very dangerous place right now. So that's an example of that.
One student I had at Roosevelt University, who came out and to say to their parents that this is not who I am. Also, their parents then cut them off from their financial aid. So, opportunities for education, opportunities to move forward, social mobility, all of those pieces then became in jeopardy for this particular student.
Yeah. All right, let's keep moving, I think.
Sure. I think if there's more, if folks are more interested in these terms, or learning more about these terms, we have a number of resources that can be provided to you to go into and some of these terms. Okay.
We're not going to be teaching these slides to you or reading them to you, but we really want to introduce concepts that are important in a number of situations. Intersectionality is not a new term. It's been around, was started by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's an African-American woman that really acknowledged the experience of African-American women in the civil rights movement and the human rights movement and the women's rights movement. We're going to show a resource here, but really just looking at cultural identity as a sum of all of who we are. And we know that for some of us, we live on privileged sides in terms of our class, our gender, our abilities, and for others, we lived on sides that are marginalized or treated as less than, or might have more difficulty accessing services or respect. So we really just ask you to look at the folks that we work with in this holistic way. And we're going to share with you a resource right now that is a video clip that talks a little bit more about this. So share. No, that's going to be this one. Okay. Can you see it, Freedom?
I cannot.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we're good.
Okay.
I'm Sarah Hyatt in Lafayette College. I'd like to welcome Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a
Hold on, this is not the one.
It was the previous, just hit the back button, I think.
Okay.
Today we hear the call for full equality for women and distinctly for women of color from a multiplicity of perspectives. Intersectionality is a term we often hear, but what does it mean? Kimberly and explains it with a metaphor.
Consider an intersection made up of many roads. The roads are the structures of race, gender identity, class, sexuality.
Is it frozen?
Disability, and the traffic running through those roads are the practices and policies that discriminate against people. Now, if an accident happens, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. So if a Black woman is harmed because she is in an intersection, her injury could result from discrimination from any or all directions.
Intersectionality in all discussions of the rights of African American women today is built on the work of previous generations who have always been a part of the fight for full equality. Sojourner Truth escaped slavery in 1827 and became one of the most powerful women's rights activists of her time. She emphasized her identity as both African American and woman in her famous Ain't I a Woman speech at the Women's Convention in 1851. In 1893, Anna Julia Cooper addressed the World Congress of Representative Women, saying, "The white woman could at least plead for her own emancipation. The Black woman, doubly enslaved, could but suffer and struggle and be silent." They demanded recognition of both the femaleness and Blackness of African American women in the struggle for political and social advancement. In 1951, the Sojourners for Truth put a call out to Negro women to convene in Washington, D.C. for a Sojourn for Truth and Justice. 132 women from 14 states responded. During the Sojourners' last Eastern Seaboard Conference, they discussed the organizational tenets of fighting against triple oppression facing working-class Black women, of racism, sexism, and classism. Their efforts were a precursor to the Black freedom activism of the Black Power era and the Black feminist movement. Named for a raid led by Harriet Tubman, which freed more than 750 slaves. The Combahee River Collective was founded in 1974 by a group of self-identified queer Black feminists. Their Combahee River Collective statement was one of the earliest explorations of the intersection of multiple oppressions to include sexuality. They stated, "Our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable." The words and actions of these leaders continue to contribute to today's discussion around intersectionality, feminism, and civil rights that demand equality and inclusion for all. Hey guys, it's Julesy. If you
Okay, did we have some sound issues with that?
It's a little bit delayed, but I think it was okay.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, so we wanted to give that example to also really honor the experience of African American women and their very courageous part in the roots of the anti-violence movement and the anti-sexual violence movement as well. So we're going to keep moving and show you, oops, not going. I'm trying to forward the PowerPoint.
All of these resources can be made available to you later on. Valerie, there was a question about sending the link for the video.
Absolutely, yeah, that video link is on our page of resources, which is part of the agenda. Yeah, so this is a picture that many of you have probably seen before that really just look at images of intersectionality. It was addressed in the video in terms of the identity collection of race, class, and gender. There are a lot of other pieces, and this is certainly not an inclusive picture of people's cultural identities, but again, treating the whole person, using a holistic lens, and using a lens that also understands the power of privilege and also oppression in people's lives is why this concept is important. So we're going to keep moving here if there are not any questions. I'm going to share a couple pieces of research that I've had the opportunity to participate in, really for the example of cultural humility in terms of learning from immersive experiences, learning from relational experiences, learning from lived experiences that have impacted myself, and I know also Freedom's experience and ability to connect with various communities and cultures. I'm not going to go into this at all in detail, but just to really point you to some of the outcomes of this. So some of the research that was done a few years ago in Central and Latin America with some colleagues of mine from Harper College, really focused on psychological and emotional stress from college students that are immigrants, particularly acculturative stress, and some of the outcomes of that directly connect to what we know about in cultural humility perspectives is the need to gain awareness and knowledge of pre-migration factors in people's lives. What is the story of overcoming that a family or an individual comes from? Because it has a direct connect to how they're going to perceive helping sources now. Also exploring culturally sensitive interventions that mitigate acculturative stress and understand that acculturative stress can result in addiction issues, mental health issues, physical health issues. So really understanding that as a framework, and Freedom's going to talk to that in a little bit. Looking at practitioners and the need for practitioners that are culturally grounded, and then focusing on engagement in education systems, engagement in community practice systems. And then language that you've heard us say a few different times is focusing on equity. Equity not being equal, and we're not going to show you a video on that because there's plenty out there, but really focusing on access to services in a way that lifts up opportunities for folks that generally have less access to resources or privilege to use services. Some of the another outcome of this field research in Central America is really just focusing on what works for youth and people moving into their young adult life, is really understanding that there is cultural diversity among indigenous groups and cultures, particularly in Central America, also in other areas such as Uganda and Rwanda, where there is so much diversity in language and rituals. The connectors are actually the same connectors that we might have with our youth and young adults in the US: sports, music, rituals, traditions, celebrations, but understanding also the legacies that people bring with them to their current family experiences. That might include poverty or war or refugee experiences, trying to escape war, whether they're young children or adults, as well as ecological disasters that have not been tended to by government functions. So this is one of the pieces that really helps us to understand that we need to treat people as experts on their own lives. Another piece of research that again connects to ways that we can use cultural humility in our work today in the United States is research that I participated in Uganda in terms of understanding culturally responsive services and what works and what doesn't work for people that are in experiences of sexual exploitation, as well as working with women in Uganda that are in experiences of really developing their community in a post-genocide framework. And one of the pieces that comes together is the inter-community development. So women's drumming is an example of what has worked for healing circles, where this particular organization not only provides this community building experience, but also inside of that experience, counseling, prevention education, health education. So there's some very innovative and creative examples that we can take from what is working in international communities to really listening and understanding what is working here today with folks that we're serving. The last area of research that I participated in Central America was looking at the connections of Mayan indigenous communities to First Nation communities in the United States Great Lakes region. So I had the opportunity to work with communities of Mayan collectives in Guatemala, as well as the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, looking at collectives and what people again do that helps them move forward in their communities. And some of the highlights of that research that was very much connecting those two communities is the role of faith, the role of intentional communities, bringing people together to have a sense of community, what that might look like in Lake County or in Palatine, where there's a community roots garden that brings people together in intentional communities. So also opportunities for really understanding in our roles with people and in our learning about people's lives, the context of neocolonialism, which we'll speak to in a little bit, of community development and helping people build their own communities from the ground up. I know in Lake County right now, there's a focus on really focusing on resources and listening to community voices, and Zion, North Chicago, Waukegan, as a way to create some sustainable services that really are culturally grounded for serving folks in need. And then the other pieces that were some of the connections from this research is the impact and innovation of recovery efforts. When it is community-centered, it's more sustainable. The common thread through a lot of this research, and Freedom and I have been speaking about this in different ways, is us having to check ourselves. And I wrote check ourselves at the borders, and that could be the border into a different country or community. It also could be the border in terms of entering someone's space by building a relationship with them. And it's really important for us to come from this place of what is already working, what is already strong, what is already a resource, what is already safe, when we're building up people's support with them.
Yeah. Valerie, there was a question about an opportunity to volunteer at some of these organizations or some of the work that you've done in the past. Is there a way for you to provide a connection to some of those places?
Absolutely. Yeah, and our emails are in the PowerPoint and also on the resources, so I'm happy to respond to someone individually with those resources or share them out when Adam's sharing the results of the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Is that all right, Freedom?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Do you want me to take this, or would you want to take it? This is kind of our shift over to talking about models for cultural competency.
Go ahead and please lead. I will jump in.
Okay. Okay. So we have some pretty heavy slides here that give you different models, and then the resources that we put together, we have links in organizations and articles and media related to all of these. What we really want to do is start from where we are and then where we're headed. So many of us that are in counselor, social work, case manager roles know that there's a model from Terry Cross that started 90s, early 2000s, that focuses on cultural competency as a developmental approach. And the term intercultural competency is one that has been favored more so because it really focuses on that intersectionality piece and the relationships between cultural identity factors and the relationships between people that are coming in with various cultural backgrounds. So that's where that phrase comes from. Cultural competency has been seen as a developmental approach. The move toward cultural humility is honestly trying to move away from that. There is this continuum, and we've showed it to you in a couple different ways through the slides, that starts with cultural destructiveness, not having information, causing harm, invalidating, and other experiences that we would have with folks that we're helping, to an incapacity, like I want to help, but I can't figure this out because I'm so focused on my own lens and perspective here, to cultural blindness, which is just as dangerous as destructiveness and incapacity, to really looking at pre-competence, competence, and proficiency. There's a lot of benefit to this model in terms of a lot of the learning that can reduce bias, a lot of the learning that can focus on ways to intervene and educate and use our activism. And there's also some limitations in terms of this proficiency, because it suggests that when we get there, we're good. Like we're one and done on this. And that's very much of a white supremacy perspective in terms of a linear model that takes us from A to Z, and then we can sort of wash our hands and we're finished with this process.
Right.
So although there's a tremendous amount of value in this, and Cross has also written on the limitations of this, there's also some limitations in terms of our ability then to begin each new relationship with a sense of humility and transparency and the need for trust building and credibility building. So do you want to offer anything?
Right. Yeah, I think some of the consequences to the cultural destructiveness and wanting to help, sometimes our efforts to help and or assist can result in a number exacerbating some of the barriers that people have already experienced through forced migration. So, for example, there was a Pakistani refugee family that we spoke to when I worked at the Asian Health Coalition, and we did cultural competency workshops for medical interns and residents. And during the month of Ramadan, there was one patient, particularly, they had cancer, and the doctor refused, or the doctor believed that the patient refused to utilize the treatment, which required a clip on the side of the waist for them to do prayer, and that interfered with their prayer. And that particular instance, the doctor did not have an interpreter available, and instead relied on a family member to interpret for them, which resulted in a delay in the treatment for the patient. So that's one part of this too, is the language piece is incredibly important. So one resource I recommend is we put there previously, is the cross-cultural interpretation services, what we worked in the past. And I know that they actually do virtual sessions as well too. So both having language access, and then someone who's able to be a cultural interpreter as well.
Thank you. Sorry, I flipped on the slide there. Yeah.
No, it's okay.
I know that we offered that the language services somewhere in the PowerPoint for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So the cultural competency models, and we're going to go through a few of them here, really start with self-awareness and understanding of multicultural groups. So there's a resource that we offered for you called An Introduction to Cultural and Linguistic Competency, as well as looking at multicultural competencies. The work of Daryl Wing Sue is one that we'd like to highlight with the video. He's done a tremendous amount of work with multicultural education and practice and social work practice and counseling and academia, as well as helping practitioners understand the impact of microaggressions and microinvalidations. So we're going to show a video clip in a minute with this. The stages and levels, according to Terry Cross, is another cultural competency model. And then something called the multicultural orientation theory, where it really focuses on leveraging information about cultural experiences in the helping relationship. So we're going to speak through some of them.
There was a quick question that came in. So are we moving away from cultural competency? I'm saying, I would say no. It's moving with cultural competency to cultural humility.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and so this is a slide that kind of speaks to what we're talking about. I'm going to back up for a minute, and we're going to watch a quick media clip from Daryl Wing Sue. Okay. All right, this is what Freedom talked about earlier in terms of some of the limits of technology. So there are several videos in the resources that we're sharing with you. So these are different examples. Are we up on the screen, Freedom?
Yes.
Okay, these are different examples that we're going to move through, some in more detail than others, really with the focus on the integrative transnational model, which is along with the multicultural orientation model, very much aligned with the cultural humility perspective. When we talk about cultural humility, one of the frameworks that we use for understanding this is culturally responsive service delivery, which certainly addresses intercultural competency and bias and and service delivery that we talked about before, as well as social determinants of well-being. The culturally responsive engagement and empowerment strategies that we're going to focus on, a focus on building capital, understanding stereotype threat and its impact on folks that we serve, and understanding growth and fixed mindset. So we're going to spend some time talking through each of these areas. Okay. Do you want to take this, Freedom, or would you like me to?
I can take this.
Okay.
So thinking about as practitioners and also as therapists and case managers, one of the things that you can consider when treating your patients or working with your clients, when an individual comes out are impacted by perceived cultural stereotypes, so it's called stereotype threat, that we are actually fulfilling the stereotype that we believe that is assigned to us. Mindset orientation, individuals that exhibit fixed and growth mindsets, which are the impact learning, a theory that's resulting from the research of Carol Dweck. So understanding you're working to be saying, I'm able to do this, or I believe I can do this, and moving forward. And then looking at capital, helping individuals recognize the connections they have and can develop and enable them to empower them and develop and pursue their goals. So Valerie and I had discussions about kind of the difference between economic, social, and political capital. And so, I think it's important for us to be able to help our clients move forward in their lives, but also not telling them that this is the best thing for them. So helping them arrive to the kind of the decisions that maybe learning a language or being able to advocate for themselves or advocate for their own resources is a good thing.
Absolutely. Okay. So these are some examples, Freedom, with stereotype threat, if you want to respond to this. So undercuts conventional assumptions that are genetics or cultural differences that lead to some individuals. Group stereotypes can threaten how individuals elevate themselves, which alters an academic identity, mental health, and intellectual performance. So, for example, if you're sitting in a classroom and you are the perceived kind of liaison for a particular group, and also asking questions of why a particular group of individuals behave in a certain way, and they're looking to you as an authority. And then social psychological predicament, researchers believe that the set members of any group about who are negative stereotypes exist. So I think all of these pieces are working towards understanding why it's important to be, how it connects to cultural humility, and why it's important to be able to know when or recognize when you're intervening with clients and speaking, and how you're working and speaking with clients to be able to help them. I'm not sure if you want to be able to share some examples, Valerie. Sure. Yeah, and so a couple of examples that come to my mind, and this is useful information for working with students and school systems and college systems as well as with clients, is if we have somebody coming in, people are very well aware of how they're perceived socially and culturally, particularly when they're coming from a marginalized community or a community that is experiencing systemic or individual oppression in their daily lives. So I'm thinking about the work that I did with Mundelein and Waukegan schools, where I would have a young man come in, put his hood on, cross his arms in the back of the classroom. He was showing me where he'd been and what he had done to survive. Okay, so he is very well aware of how he may be perceived, and he's going to come in with a defensive posture, if you will, in order for me not to hurt him in the way that he might have been hurt before by other systems. In clinical settings or practice settings, this also relates to what we talked about before in terms of goal setting and internalized oppression. People are well aware of how they've been perceived, of where they've been included, excluded, judged, accepted. So they're really teaching you a lot about where they've been by how they present themselves. And it's really our responsibility then to explore that and to create a space where those defenses don't have to be first and foremost in their relationships with us. These are slides on mindset, like Freedom said, Carol Dweck. There are a lot of other researchers on mindset, but it's really important, again, to come from a place of growth mindset so that we can see someone's capacity, so that we can look at the recovery or healing or helping process as a process and not an end goal. And it focuses on empowerment and building up of resources in the same way that a learning setting does. So do you want to add anything else to this, Freedom?
No, sorry.
Sorry. These are some examples of things that we can do when we're working with clients, when we're focused on a growth mindset. So helping clients realize their mindsets, learn about the way that they think, about learning, about achieving goals, about accomplishing things that they're focused on, and also focusing on their effort and the skills that they're using. So one way to understand mindset is thinking about roles as parents. So if we give too much general praise to a child, it's not going to help that child learn specifically about their skills, their strengths, their challenges. But if we focus on their effort and on their learning and on their many successes, that's going to really increase their sense of efficacy, or the I can do this skill that the child will develop. So it's very similar with mindset. And again, we have resources at the end that focus more on use of growth mindset and helping settings. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think a part of it also is like a growth mindset is also, you want to be able to convey that making mistakes is part of growth and it's okay. I think that it's being able to convey that to your clients is paramount in moving towards cultural humility.
Absolutely. And I'm even thinking of a lot of examples in the counseling setting where that ability to recover, regroup, apologize, take a step back, start again in the relationships between clients and helpers is really very foundation building compared to not having any struggle in that relationship. So this is the area of capital. And Freedom, you mentioned social, cultural, economic capital before. This is part of the culturally responsive service delivery model that focuses on increasing clients' ability to navigate social resources and relationships, economic as well as cultural. So Freedom, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I think, we mentioned this before. Social capital is a phenomenon, and it's something that we want to be able to present the resources to our clients and to the people that we serve so that they can make their own decisions about how to best use the social capital that they gain or develop. So, for example, I think, my mother, knew and understood the importance of education. But the folks that she was seeing at Truman College, who were her counselors, kept continuing to push her to do more classes, more work, pursue an associate's degree. And I think she was so terrified by those prospects, it affected kind of her own self-confidence and ultimately delayed her education even further. So I think one of those pieces is making sure that we understand in our service delivery is that helping clients kind of gain and take gather more of their resources and being able to help them, allowing them to empower themselves and make their own best judgments around their future. So gaining a better sense of agency in their own lives.
Thank you. And here are some examples with that piece. What clients can do, what we can do, because this is really coming from a partnership. And I think one of the ways in counseling settings, but also in community organizing settings, that folks can really own the capital resources that are available for them is when those resources come within their own community. And I think that's a piece that directly connects to the cultural humility perspective, especially when so many of us have come from training and education about our ability and power and you know, as helpers, is to really look at the person's own community where that they can look for models, mentors, examples, whether it's around career exploration, whether it's around next steps for college, whether it's around how does a family navigate a special education system in the school to have those resources. I know in my own community of Mundelein, the Universidad de Padres, that is part of the bilingual parent advisory council out of the high schools and the elementary districts, has been huge in terms of its ability to help folks navigate their capital. So I think we really need to look for those communities, those community centers. A lot of park districts and libraries now have a lot of the community center folks working with them in terms of providing resources. So really looking inside someone's cultural community also increases their ability to use that capital.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Another piece that falls under the umbrella of culturally responsive service delivery that comes from a culturally responsive teaching standpoint is the work of Geneva Gay. And again, we have a lot of resources. And it's going to sound redundant here, but this is actually a treasure of a model. But it's a client engagement and also an organizational development approach that can be used in terms of fostering inclusion and equity in organizations. The focus of this model values, recognizes, and honors clients' unique cultural, social, and interpersonal experiences. So you're really starting with that foundation as a strength, as a resiliency factor, as an identity factor that is meant to be uplifted. It also affects how the client is impacted by receiving services. So whether it's somebody that has not accessed formal services before, to really understand why and how that has been, or the services or the connections or the supports they've used inside of their own cultural community or faith community is really significant. But it also shows, I think the humility piece belongs to the practitioner with this in terms of understanding how a formalized system for scheduling an appointment and traveling to somewhere, and you have that 1 hour in the relationship to begin your work, sometimes is limiting for people that come from different cultural backgrounds where that type of helping is more natural or organic in communities. So this really just starts by valuing the person's unique cultural experiences and their understanding of help resources. Some of the characteristics inside of this model, and we could spend a whole day on this, is really validating the experience, the resources, the strengths the person already has, looking at it in a comprehensive or holistic way, understanding that the helping process, the educational process, the healthcare delivery process is multidimensional and is going to impact a person at different times throughout their life, but also it's going to impact their family. So a lot of the folks that we work with at Zacharias Center, we might be working with a parent, or we might be working with a teen or a father or a sibling, but we understand the impact of our work and the ability for that person's healing and recovery process to impact the other relationships that they have. So we really are working with the whole system. Another tenet of the culturally responsive service delivery model is empowerment. Empowerment is an old term, and it's a new term in terms of our abilities and our ways of empowering. This is not about the helper giving power to the client. It's about the helper facilitating a process where the client can realize their own power. And there's a very big difference with that. There's a lot of research in the last 10 years coming out of a lot of racial identity research, if you will, that focuses on the significance of not identifying young people of color as at risk so much, but at promise. And what is it that we need to create in the system around them to help them activate on their goals, to realize their goals, to see their strengths, to see their networks, so it's not coming from a deficit model. And that's really the value of a lot of Geneva Gay's research, is it doesn't come from a deficit model in terms of serving people that are generally underserved. The last couple tenets of this model is that it's transformative in terms of impacting the helper, but also the client or the person that's being cared for in the situation, that it really changes their identity and their ability to navigate in the world. We know for a lot of our colleagues of color, a lot of the folks that we serve, that the act of even walking out the door in the morning means leaving a part of themselves behind in order to be seen or accepted or welcomed in various spaces. So the transformation that can happen in this model is we help somebody bring their full selves to the table in their counseling or helping process, but also in their workplace, in their school setting. So it's a very transformative process. And then the last piece is the emancipation or the emancipatory nature of the service delivery process, in that it really helps people connect with a broader community around them, connect with their own hopes and promise, connect with their goals ahead, and be able to come from a place of empowerment, but also liberation in terms of being able to stand solid with who they are without having to leave part of themselves behind in a setting, and without having to rely on other people to give them their power and privilege, if you will. So I know that was a general overview of this golden resource here. Freedom, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it's we discussed this previously, Valerie, but moving away from that kind of Western practices and understanding and valuing people where they are, meeting with them where they are. I know that for the refugee community, particularly from during the Vietnam experience or Vietnamese refugee experience, it's a lot of the people. Their survival meant being able, it's woven deeply into who they are. And so a lot of their survival is steeped in, their family connections, traditions, religion. So having to interface with those kind of barriers and experiences and trauma here in the United States, or being told that, that's not the right way to solve this problem, you should go here, I think really can exacerbate some of the conditions and the trauma that people might be experiencing. So it's critical for us to be able to validate and acknowledge all the different kind of pieces that go into a person's experience to best help them.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. A piece that's important, and I spoke to a little bit with the research before, is a culture of stress. And I'm going to invite Freedom to begin this one in terms of just talking about the impact of this experience on folks that we serve.
Yeah, I think, the expectation of first overcoming the barriers that from forced migration to come to, let's say, the United States, but then also trying to adapt and live your best life and be the best version of who you are. All of those pieces, come all at once to play, and it could cause a very deep stress and anxiety, depression for a number of folks. Particularly within the refugee community, a lot of these pieces are not recognized either because social mental health is stigmatized. So I remember as a child having to serve as an interpreter on a number of different occasions, helping my mother fill out paperwork for benefits, for food stamps, link card, and whatever else. But that as a 7 or 8 year old, having to rely on a 7 or 8 year old to do that put an awful lot of stress on me. So thinking about all of these different ways to kind of help somebody, and thinking about all the different kinds of pieces that go into a person's identity that might, when you're helping or working with them, that might cause even more anxiety or stress on someone. Do you want to chime in, Valerie?
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking of other examples. And I know for those of us that have been formally trained that we look at increased incidences of mental health, suicide, addiction in Native American communities, sometimes without the conversation about the role of a culture of stress. We also look at some of the identity development challenges of first generation South Asian families without talking about a culture of stress. So just understanding that you know, a lot of our history around looking at immigration and refugee experiences talks about assimilation, but not a culture load of stress. And it really is our responsibility to honor the whole person so that they don't have to let go of those pieces, but also look at resources that they can use when they're having those struggles. And I'm thinking about a lot of young people that I grew up with, but also community members and neighbors in the town that I live in right now, that really are struggling to thrive in their new generation without the same system of supports and values around them.
Yeah, and I would encourage people to not think of it just as you know, a transnational identity or moving from one place to another, but anyone who has to, you know, anyone who is no longer relying on a system that they were used to and moving to a new system would experience some kind of acculturative stress. So just keep that in mind. It's not restricted to an ethnicity or a race per se.
Yeah, thank you. All right, another piece of this that fits in here is looking at feminist theory, which very much overlays the intersectionality piece. It also overlays the transnational integrative model, is really being very clear in our work as helpers of the impact of power and privilege in our lives, as well as the impact of power and privilege and oppression in clients' lives. And really looking at the client-helper relationship as a partnership with a culture of feedback. So there's not an ingrained hierarchy of value in that relationship, and treating the person as a whole person. There's a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding, a lot of bias around the word, the F word of feminism, but it really is about acknowledging power, privilege, and oppression in our relationships as different genders, different classes, different abilities, different ethnicities. So it very much is a tool for us to use. And I know at Zacharias Center, part of our base of our work is really entering people's lives with an understanding that people have had different experiences of power and privilege and oppression. And it's really our work to begin to create a new experience for people in an environment of respect and empowerment and acceptance for the full selves that they bring here. So that's an example of that. Okay. We're going to take a shift now and talk about, we've talked about some models of cultural competency, and we're just going to take a little bit of a history lesson here in terms of looking at where we started, where we're headed in terms of intercultural competency education, but also building up competencies for practitioners. So you'll see on the slide here that we've really come from various models of cultural competency as a developmental task, so the stages models. And then we've also come from in community organizations and universities and schools from this idea of diversity education and looking at like isms and obias, looking at various months. You know, in the United States, we have various months and issues that we celebrate every month, which is important and valuable. And it also reminds us that we have months that we celebrate folks that are marginalized because they're still marginalized. So if October is Disability Awareness Month, the fact that we have to have that month is because the other 11 months of the year, we might not be focused on all the resources that are inherent in the disability community. So moving from diversity education to multicultural and inclusion dialogues. Freedom and I have had the opportunity to partner together with organizations and in college settings around these inclusion dialogues, which is very different than diversity. The inclusion is really about finding tools and processes and ways to help people bring them their full selves to the table in workplaces and settings and agencies, but also on looking at different organizational processes and systemic issues that then can promote more inclusion and decision making and policies that organizations hold. So there are a lot of workplace trainings that are focused on diversity and inclusion. The inclusion piece is the hardest piece right now.
Yeah.
Do you want to add to that at all?
I would say the greatest difference between diversity and inclusion, multicultural inclusion, is actively creating a space that maximizes the value for people who are all walks of life, different backgrounds.
Yes, yes. Another transition that we've made is moving from like the months model or holidays and holy days celebrating to really conscious inclusion and allyship. And we're going to talk in a bit about allyship, but that conscious inclusion, the language that Freedom just used, is really about also paying attention to settings and situations where there have been processes or policies that have been exclusive and that normalize or make it normative to exclude particular people. So this is a shift that really requires a lot of individual focus, but also organizational focus.
Valerie, just sorry for 1 second. I don't want to make anyone feel like we are ignoring your questions. So Mary, I know you had a question posed in here. We can come back to that since we have to move through the slides, but we'll make sure to answer your question later on.
Thank you. I'm glad that you can see them. And the last pieces here are really on a model of bearing witness. So accepting, lifting up, honoring, as well as advocacy and activism. Many of our organizations provide advocacy. Many of us are involved with advocacy in our personal or social justice lives or other systems that we work with. But really looking at the value, even if we're in a practitioner or clinical role, of that individual advocacy, that systems advocacy, and also being aware on a macro level of policies, social policies that impact the folks that we serve, as well as activism, and we'll speak to that in a little bit. The last piece right now, which is I think where we're sitting a lot in our different organizations, is a focus on inclusion, equity, and social justice. Social justice is an umbrella term that absolutely focuses on racial justice, as well as a lot of other cultural identity experiences that have been impacted by oppression or inequitable access to services. So where many of our organizations are at right now is the inclusion, equity, and social justice, which is sort of the now what after all of these other pieces and layers. Do you want to add anything, Freedom?
Nope, you covered it.
Okay. All right. So one piece that, and this is just a tidbit to give us pause to reflect a little bit since Freedom and I have been talking at you for a bit, is just to ask ourselves. So this is a model that can be used for advocacy, for activism. It also could be just used for our own learning about a particular cultural community. And where are we in terms of supporting oppressive experiences or not acknowledging them or being aware of them to confronting oppressive experiences. So this is a model that's called a social action continuum that gives us a variety of opportunities throughout to focus on learning. And this overlays the cultural humility model, and that really as we move ourselves along to educating ourselves, educating others, supporting and encouraging, working with our cohorts and colleagues and coworkers to support their cultural humility, this gives us an opportunity for this type of activism.
Yeah, it's important to also take this continuum into to know that it's actually contextual as well too. So I am comfortable initiating and preventing racist, sexist, classist incidences, or I'm witnessing, but then I'm also considering the situation in my own safety. So know that it's contextual in terms of when you decide to act or to educate or to be able to enter that conversation.
Yeah. And we've been immersed in a lot of conversations as organizations, but also as people and family members around racial justice oppression and activism, I'll say recently, but for the long haul also. And what we might choose to do in a family setting in terms of initiating, interrupting, might look different than we would in a work setting or in a relationship with somebody that's a counselor to us or a teacher to us. So the role of power and privilege and the authority that we have in these different situations might impact also how we respond in the different situations.
Yes.
All right, so this is a pause break so that we can hear from you and maybe respond to some of these questions that have popped up. And Freedom, you clarified before, it's not moving away from cultural humility, away from cultural competency, but moving to cultural humility. I do think a way of doing this is to talk about moving away from westernized approaches as our main approach that we use to the helping profession. So we just really want to ask you, and you can put some pieces into the chat here, why you think this is significant. Freedom, are you able to see the chat?
Nothing yet.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. Being open to others' cultures. Moving away from Western hegemony. Approach from Western melting pot. Unified approach from the Western melting pot. We have to be sensitive to all cultures, to recognize and validate approaches. It is also that we don't think that Western approaches are only one way, because one approach won't work for everyone. That's excellent. It is a very limited viewpoint and leads to bias. And it also helps us to evolve and learn. And Western cultures tend to prioritize a culture over that culture over the culture of others. Right. I think this speaks to a lot of our understanding of how we learn as well in our body of knowledge. And we refer to the book by Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So how do we know what we know, and how did our knowledge come to be, and how do we continue to pass on that knowledge and teach others?
That's an excellent resource.
Yeah.
Are there other chats that we want to share?
Sure. There's so much value in seeing things from other points of view, and promoting Western over others promotes implicit bias. Thank you so much for all of your responses.
Yeah, thank you for reading. Yeah. Okay. So Freedom and I are both going to speak to some of these pieces, but I think that this is a reminder right now in terms of our value base, but also our why, in terms of entering this work from a cultural humility perspective. So you've heard us say a lot about the power and privilege that comes with a professional practitioner relationship. That's not good or bad, it just is. Similar to power and privilege in our daily lives, is it's more what we do with it. And how we use it in service to the other that makes a difference. We cannot do this work without owning our own cultural identity factors, thinking of the intersectionality image, if you will, the pieces of our own history, roots, and foundations that give us access to resources but also limit us, our experiences that we've had for folks that have experienced trauma. That becomes part of our framework, our foundation that we bring into new experiences. There's a lot of work right now around understanding ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that for many becomes a part of their foundation in terms of cultural identity, but also social determinants of health and vulnerability factors and protective factors that move into our adult lives with us. So I'm also including trauma in this picture of who we are in terms of our roots and our backgrounds. And one piece that Freedom and I think is really important to talk about is achieved credibility versus ascribed credibility. White supremacist culture teaches us that ascribed credibility is the norm. Like I'm supposed to expect a 7-year-old that I work with at Zachariah Center to come in and trust me and like me and feel comfortable with me and want to come back and see me because I have a degree and I'm acting in the role of a therapist and I have an incredible setting around me that the child can use to express themselves. Until I build trust, until I create a safe and brave space for that child, until I spend time with the child, until I'm able to listen to the child and focus on the child and have all of my presence be focused on that person, I'm not going to achieve the credibility that I need to help that person in their healing process. And I think that it's important for us to keep in check the norm of ascribed credibility in the different settings that we work with. Because I think we can do harm when we come from that place of expecting trust, whether it's with a new person that we supervise, whether it's with a client, whether it's with a community member that we're building a connection to. compared to really taking the time, which is moving away from Western models, to take time and build the relationship first. Growing up myself in a Native American community in Upper Peninsula, Michigan, I learned a lot about what it took for my family to be included in the culture in there, which is now lifelong as a relationship, but also observed a lot of folks being very disappointed, irritated that people weren't automatically included as professional helpers in the community. And I think it gave me a source of background knowledge as I enter various community relationships now, that unless I'm willing to hang out with somebody and for us to get to know each other in a different way and share the parts of my identity that are not connected to power and privilege, I'm not going to be able to build an authentic or effective relationship with that person. So do you want to add in, Freedom?
Yeah, so I can talk about the introduction piece and greetings, and I think the example you shared previously was really intensive for me when we were preparing their presentation. I think a large part of kind of Western identity is making sure explicitly saying who you are and your credentials and you know, where you fall in or what organization you belong to. And often when I think interacting with folks, particularly with someone who might be in need, presenting those kinds of credentials may make someone feel like they are unable to say something to you, or they're unable to share, and essentially it affects the level of trust too in building your relationship, and it sets the tone as well too. So I'm not sure, you want to share your example that was when you were at the conference, or?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But then I'm going to invite you to share one also.
Sure, no problem.
I was in a training experience with a coalition that I'm part of, and we were talking about gender expression and gender identity. And they said to describe yourself using a plant, right? And so I said, you know, my favorite smell on the earth is moss. And they all just kind of looked at me like I was funny, right? But oftentimes it's really hard for us to step out of those types of experiences where we're defining ourselves as our credentials or our accomplishments. Somebody else would say, what's your favorite hobby? And a colleague might say, I like going on cruises. And I would say, that's great. That's wonderful. If I say that, I'm going to really create an exclusive situation here. So I'm going to say what's true is I like taking walks with my dog. So you're bringing it to a commonality to build a connection with somebody. So Freedom, how would you describe yourself? How would you introduce yourself without using privilege?
I think when I enter into a space, most of the time there is an expectation for me to explain who I am, especially my name, which is unusual. So, and being from a refugee community, but I often also try to restrict myself from having to say and defend who I am. That's important when coming into a space, and it's also tied to the cultural humility. You don't have to always defend and advocate who you are. You belong in that space and not having to say so. With that said, I found myself entering in an Asian American workshop around identity, and I walked into the space and I started to list all the things that I've done in the community and my community activist and philanthropic work. And one person stepped up after me and said, I'm Joe, and that's it, and sat back down. And it stopped me and put me in my place and to think, okay, it's okay for me to be who I am and where I am. I don't always have to figure out a way to kind of specify my bravado of my work and professional titles and things like that. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any comments or questions based on us addressing the comments in this slide here?
I don't think there are any comments right now.
Okay. Sometimes when we have this kind of conversation, there's some reaction, or not defensiveness, but just reaction to like, wait a minute, I worked really hard to get where I am. You know, why don't I get to present myself this way? And the impact is about what is the space that we can create to build an authentic connection with people that we're serving. It's not that our hard work and accomplishments don't matter and don't lead us to be more capable of doing the work that we do. It's just about how we enter that space with other people.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we're going to talk through, this is sort of the bridge here that certainly envelops the culture of humility, but has us take a different perspective on some of what we've been taught around practices that involve culture of humility, but also honestly appropriation of what has already been available in many of the cultures that people come from to the United States. So one area is mindfulness, meditation, and contemplative practices. One of our United States founders of this term, if you will, is Howard Zinn, who's done a tremendous amount of work in terms of the understanding of mindfulness as being active and open attention on the present. There's a lot of impact of meditation and mindfulness on positive physical health, on recovery, on healing, on grounding. But what we also know is that there are many cultures in different countries that folks come from to the United States that have used these practices in their faith systems and their community systems, in their rituals for thousands and thousands of years. So again, as we're integrating different practices into our work with clients, I think it's really important to understand the cultural background and the experiences that clients have, bringing these healing rituals, if you will, into their own lives, but from a different place than U.S. Western culture. So the image on the left is something from Dr. John Kabat-Zinn. The image on the right is something from El Salvador, in a space that is available for healing from people that are veterans and second generation survivors of the war in El Salvador from the 1980s. So again, very similar practices, but I think we need to really honor the roots of where these practices come from for many of our community members. Do you want to add anything, Freedom?
No, yeah, I think it's as we are, thinking about academia and epistemology and, all the references we have here, as we give credit for the academics and the practitioners and the researchers, we need to also do the same for some of the knowledge that hasn't always been recognized in the past. So a lot of these practices have been appropriated from many, like Valerie has talked about, and then moving away from the westernized practices, right? That also acknowledges where a lot of these practices came from.
Thank you. Okay. So this tree is not meant to make your eyes hurt so much, but it's called a tree of contemplative practices. And this is a pretty well-rounded image of different practices that people can use, and healing and recovery practices that also gives us some cross-cultural examples. And again, it's not for us to say this is the tool that you need to use, but you'll see here, in addition to what we would use is like walking, meditation, yoga, dance, retreats, centering. There's also music and singing. There's contemplative arts. There's work and volunteering that helps many people heal and recover, particularly folks that struggle with lifelong mental health challenges. There are also vigils and marches, which is a part of people's recovery. When I was in Uganda doing some research, the activism piece that many families participated in was part of their healing journey. And I don't know that we look at that in terms of US culture, that's part of what gives us power and hope and fulfillment. I know there's been many opportunities lately for participation in vigils and marches, but to really honor that as a part of somebody's healing and recovery process. There are also retreats, meditation, improvisation, bearing witness. The pieces of the tree you'll look at is focus on relationships, activism, creativity, being still. And on the bottom of the tree, and I'm reading this to you just because I'm not sure how clear it is to you, it talks about community and connection, and then awareness. And those are pieces that might not be seen as tangible pieces that we bring to our relationships, but they certainly are cross-culturally. Yeah. So I don't know, Freedom, if you want to add to this?
No, I think you did a really good job.
Okay. All right, so we talked about mindfulness and meditation, and then we also talked about contemplative practices. So this goes back to understanding the cultural legacies and the pre-migration experiences for many of our families. This also has a direct connect to African American and Black families in the United States right now, so it is not necessarily limited to the Central America research that it comes from, as much as really the lived experiences of so many of our community members right now. So it's really important for us to understand, and Freedom and I are both going to address this slide, the push factors that bring people to the United States, whether it's poverty, violence, war. We know that the largest group of people that are leaving Central America right now are young men that are being exploited with economic exploitation, that are being trafficked for labor, that are leaving families in order to use their physical health and ability to move up, to travel up to the United States as a way to then support their family. But that is the largest group right now that is being pushed forth from Central America to the United States. The experiences that people have during migration leave a band of trauma for the rest of their lives. And it does not mean that they're not capable or that they can't move into healthy functioning roles, but really come from that place of having this legacy of family trauma, but then also the experiences that it takes many people for years and years, similar to veterans of active duty and war, takes people years to come forth with their stories of migration. Yes. There's an organization that Freedom and I are both connected with that's called Vider House of Hospitality, and that is in the northwest suburbs, and it houses young men that have been forced from their countries and communities, from Africa, from Central America, and takes care of and helps heal and provide resources and support for people. That is absolutely an organization that folks can volunteer with. But those experiences during migration really need to be honored as real in terms of the sort of the case management approach of starting with people now and what they need to do now to succeed in U.S. culture. Do you want to add in, Freedom?
Yeah, I just think that it's important here to note that when folks leave, when the decision is made to leave, it's not a choice. People don't take it lightly. So for my own family, we left Vietnam right after the war, and my father was imprisoned, and then they later moved to a labor camp, and the same was going to happen to my mother as well. So just know that when people decide to pick up their lives and leave to another place, it's not taken lightly. It's to leave a country, to leave their home, and to never come back. So keep that in mind. I think that's something that my mother and our family continues to struggle with throughout our lifetimes, that she made this decision so that we could have a better life, and she made that sacrifice for us.
Thank you for choosing to share that with us, Freedom. Right. So for many of our clients, there are definitely connections to legacies and social trauma. And social trauma is a word, that's a phrase that's a little different than individual trauma, in that it really is a collective experience of being connected to a group of people that have specifically been targeted. Okay, so whether it's through an experience of genocide or hate crimes, or experiences of colonization, but it really is imposes a different recovery experience that has to be individual and collective. And that is where a lot of the models for restorative justice come from, is addressing what is effective in terms of healing social trauma. And this really leads us to, as practitioners, the importance for us to be learning about these legacies from various cultural communities, but then also being aware, as if we don't have a foundation of awareness, it's really going to be hard for us to center conversations and honor the cultural experiences that people bring into the caring relationships with us. Anything else you want to add, Freedom, before we move forward?
I'm just responding to a question here. Someone was asking about the Vider House of Hospitality.
Do you want to respond to it?
Yeah, I'm just typing it in there. So just to let you know, actually, it's a very unique place. It's a collaboration between a Catholic church, a mosque, and a synagogue. So it's a multi-interfaith effort to create a space for asylum seekers.
And yeah, there's absolutely opportunities for getting connected with that organization. Okay, thank you, Freedom.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, it's 5 after 11, so we're going to welcome folks back for the final stretch here. We did try to work out our third video, and we're going to let you know that it's included in your resources. So when we reach that point in the PowerPoint, we'll let you know the name and how to access that. So this slide is an example, again, of culturally rooted practices in various communities, many of which are communities that current United States residents come from. So the cultural humility standpoint is the ability to maintain an interpersonal approach that is other-oriented, or oriented to the other, open to the other, in terms of understanding the cultural background, but also the value of the practices, whether it's faith practices, nutrition practices, giving practices. What you see in the slides here is a school in Guatemala that provides a drink in the beginning of the day that feeds the children throughout the day. And again, schools, similar to the role schools serve in the United States, provides an important role socially, educationally, emotionally, and physically in terms of meals provided through the days, particularly to agricultural communities. So that's an example of a historical piece that also is relevant to communities in the United States today. The other piece of cultural humility is that the opportunity for the practitioner to center on the cultural background of the cultural orientation that is most important to the individual, whether it's a client or student, is most important. So we might think of our own cultural identity in terms of faith, gender, ability, class, our work status, our sexual orientation, and one of those pieces of our identity might be very large in terms of the sizing, the dynamic sizing, if you will, to that in terms of our perspective of ourselves. So a lot of times in psychosocial assessments that we use when clients access services or begin with us in our services, we might include some cultural factors, certainly developmental factors, social factors, historical backgrounds in terms of trauma, substance abuse, mental health, but we often fall short in terms of that sizing, of really understanding what is most significant to the client in terms of their cultural identity. So this is a piece that reminds us to learn from the client what is most important to them in terms of their view of themselves, their identity, and even what is most important in terms of the experiences that they've come from to enter our lives. We might work with a veteran of military service, and we might decide, based on our experience with that person, that managing symptoms of post-traumatic stress is most significant, and maybe what's most significant is job training and job security, helping that person find employment in the current day. We might work with somebody that is coming into a new community and doesn't have residency status, and we might assume that's what's most important to that person is getting them registered and qualified for services in the schools. What is actually most important to that person is finding a faith community, because they're going to use individuals and relationships in that faith community to navigate school resources and healthcare resources. So those are examples of that. And I don't know, Freedom, if you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, immigrant and refugee families that come here to the United States have previously relied on kind of support structures in their lives and continue to do so if those resources are here. So, for example, I think a number of the services that my own family sought in terms of counseling, which wasn't present, or the terminology and services are not available within, or non-existent. They were able to find that within the Buddhist temple that our family are members of. The monks are actually now even taking classes in therapy and becoming certified clinical counselors. So being able to kind of recognize that there's other places and sources where families can tap into to get the services that they need. And it's not necessarily from a state or government funded organization. another piece that I wanted to clarify here in the definition, and this is separate from the term other, so other-oriented or being open to the other. This is important to note that it's not connected to the idea of othering someone else, all right? So the act of othering somebody. So part of the cultural humility piece is making sure that you value all of your clients and you value all the people that you work with, and making sure that you are respecting them. You're not in your mind putting them into a different component or part of how you understand who they are, if that makes sense.
Thank you. So one of the models that we use to move toward cultural humility is the model from Gerald Wing Sue that talks about multicultural competencies. So this model combines knowledge about different cultures and cultural perspectives, skills to utilize culturally appropriate approaches. And that's what we've been talking about, is really looking at the natural helping systems in someone's life, but also the systems where people can see people that maybe look like them, have similar backgrounds as them, or if not, then absolutely have the cultural grounding to understand the legacies that that person brings into the setting. And then thirdly, our own awareness of our own cultural heritage and the influence of our heritage on attitudes, beliefs, and experiences. One of the things that Freedom said in the beginning of the presentation is we are not our ancestors, and that can be taken in a lot of different ways. And we have the opportunity here to be pioneering without colonialism, but pioneering in terms of our ability to embrace and value and hold our biases in check. And understand the impact of our worldview and our lens on our ability to see the value in other people. So the example that Freedom just gave in terms of the othering is me seeing people that I work with from my lens as a white first generation female middle class person. Okay, so we have that opportunity to do it differently in terms of understanding the influence or the limitations of my background on my ability to fully picture and embrace someone's identity and their lived experiences. So knowledge, skills, and awareness. And this is not new to a lot of people, but we wanted to bring it here as well.
I'm sorry, Valerie, can you bring it back to the previous slide?
Yep.
Somebody here asked Adam a question about how can we as practitioners assist youth in developing their sense of self, cultural identities, when they may be living in two different worlds. So there are a number of different resources actually, and so my background actually is in immigrant and refugee youth organizing. So I can share that as an additional resource to everyone as well later, but making sure that, it's a structural consideration when you're building kind of programs or services. I'm not sure what's the context in how you're serving youth, but there are people who look at just the very things that Valerie just talked about, that there are cultural liaisons available, people who look like the populations that you're serving, making an effort in your hiring practices to consider folks who are both qualified for the position and who have the cultural knowledge and cultural humility and the ability to move between both worlds and code switching.
Yeah, that's huge. The other piece I was thinking of was the piece I said before in terms of looking at youth and young adult development, not from a place of risk factors or deficits, but what is already strong and used inside of the person's culture and inside of their own network. And there are some particular articles that I will send on that can be made available that really look at that shift in our perspective in terms of particularly working with young people of color.
And again, I'm not sure what the context is for the person who posed this question, but building in the piece of mentorship or a mentorship program where there's those opportunities for youth to be able to connect with folks who might be key leaders in their community, or who are facilitating some kind of change, or simply someone who is able to kind of speak to the acculturative stresses would be really good to have.
Thank you for noting that question. Okay. All right. So we also want to make sure, and I know Freedom mentioned this particular organization earlier, but just really looking at the impact of language. One of the articles that we gave to you talked about cultural linguistics and the impact of language on people's experience accessing services. So I'm going to invite Freedom, you to speak to this for a little bit.
Yeah, so in my time in working in Chicago, through there's a building off of Broadway and Lawrence Avenue, which is actually a social service, very social heavy in social services for refugee populations. But I came across a number of cross-cultural interpreters here. It's critical to have, especially when you send out, considering your population, right? But then also communications that go out for services for your organization. So it's critical to have culturally relevant translation, and then also interpretive services when appropriate and when able to. So, for example, I think a lot of folks who are resource strapped refer to things like Google Translate, right, to kind of put in stuff. And but a number of different pieces and nuances in how we communicate are missed. So it's important to be able to have somebody kind of look over your information. And this organization does that. It's a nonprofit organization, and in some of the cases, they have a sliding scale for a number of the different things that they do. And the misuse of family members. So I spoke to this a little earlier. This is something that I grew up with, having to be relied on for interpretation for my family, and then having the kind of a bicultural translation is critical, because there are terms and experiences that are not existent in the English language. So it's something, those are complicated things that have to be able to be explained in a different way, so that your clients or people you serve can understand them.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure we addressed that. Okay, let's keep going here. One of the other development areas that we want to focus on is the work of Sydney Shaw. And this is what we were talking about before in terms of taking advantage of cultural opportunities in our relationships with folks. So this is called multicultural orientation theory. And what we look at is the impact of the client's perception of the counselor's level or the helper's level of cultural humility. So there's a direct correlation between how, not if or what, but how the counselor addresses culture and cultural opportunities to further facilitate an exploration of the client's cultural strengths, cultural resources, and then the usefulness of the helping process. So oftentimes when there's multicultural orientation in the helping process, it reduces the frequency of the impact of microaggressions. Microaggressions, yes, that happen inside of the helping process when the counselor is not tuned in to a perspective of cultural humility. There becomes this, I know what's best for you, or I'm going to help you make the right decisions, or don't we need to do it this way, or I thought this would work well for you, to really a listening journey in terms of understanding the cultural resources that the client perceives. And then the piece that I talked about before, using dynamic sizing. So not only understanding the cultural background and history and identity, but what is most important to the client. So not assuming because we might come from a place of, economic resources are most important, or healthcare or jobs or physical abilities are most important. It might be something different to the person that we're working with in terms of their goals for themselves, but also their ability to look at their to share out and explore who they are. So certainly, and this also relates back to feminist theory, creating a culture of feedback where there's not a hierarchy of value in the client-helper relationship, and where there's this openness to feedback, to questions, to changes. I know working with so many people that have been impacted by trauma or violence, having that feedback gives gives the client a sense of control and power in that relationship, and really is reparative in a way that it doesn't balance out, but it certainly changes the experience of clients in significant relationships when there's that culture of feedback, when there's a voice in the relationship, when there's a power and control to make it different and make it better. And experience health in terms of healthy boundaries, healthy respect, unconditional regard, All of those pieces are components of this model in terms of the dynamic sizing of truly understanding what is most significant to clients, but then also being open to an exchange in terms of feedback and contributions in that partnership. Anything that you want to add to this, Freedom?
Yeah, somebody asked, a microaggression was not defined earlier on, or they didn't catch it. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yes. Go ahead if you want to, and then I can add in.
Yeah, they're essentially daily kind of verbal indignities that take place over a period of time that are derogatory and or aligned with kind of a supremacist kind of nature, to make someone feel like they don't belong or they're not a part of something. So for example, you know, I was always asked, do I celebrate Christmas around the holidays, by the same person in my office. And that was, you know, it was, I didn't interpret, and some people may not interpret that as something that's derogatory, making me feeling like it's other, but for me it did, and it took me to say, please stop asking me this question. I'm not comfortable in how it makes me feel with the intention of the question. So.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of experiences that people have in public spaces and workspaces. So it could be being treated differently coming through the checkout line where somebody asks for your ID and then doesn't ask the next person for their ID because you're a person of color. It could be an experience where you're asked, I know there's been a lot of media, for better or worse lately, in terms of increasing the visibility of how people of color are treated differently in terms of public spaces and experiences with the police. Those would be examples of microaggressions. But I think that questioning from a counselor-client relationship or from a helping professional's perspective is when you ask about parts of that person's cultural identity as if making it an issue. So it could be working with somebody who's identified as one in the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer community, and continuing to ask questions about their experience of being in that community when that might not be the reason that they're in services. You know, they might be in services because they're experiencing depression or going through a job change or recovering from a trauma. But when we shine the light on something that is a part of that person's cultural identity, we then make that an issue. If it's not coming from that person. So I don't know if those examples make sense to you. Yes,
they do. I mean, we see it every day too. I'm sure many of us in our Facebook feed, you know, the number of Karens that are out there. And there was also an immigrant family, a video I just watched recently where a man asked a family if they took a shower before using their community pool. So those kinds of instances that really are hidden, I guess, as a part of, you know, a policy. So it is policy for the pool to be to make sure that you shower before you use it, but then making assumptions about the people that are present in that space.
Yeah. And if you're looking for additional information, particularly around microaggressions, the Gerald Wing Sue resource, the Gerald Wing Sue resource is one place to start. Okay. Okay. So again, focusing on missed opportunities, and I think that we spoke to this before. So this is Sydney Shaw's work, multicultural orientation, cultural humility, and responding to cultural opportunities inside of the helping relationship. So counselors with high scores in cultural humility typically engage in collaborative, open exploration with clients regarding their cultural identity as a salient factor in treatment. Again, there's a positive correlation between the use of cultural humility and mitigating the impact of missed opportunities. That could be seen as a micro invalidation of not validating that, that part of the person's identity inside of the helping relationship. Anything you want to add to this, Freedom?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay. All right. So again, this reiterates some of what we've talked about before. We want to ask you just to take a minute and look at kind of what we've shared with you. Can you picture these opportunities in your experience with people that you work with in terms of exploring cultural identity factors and strengths and bringing them into the relationship building that you're doing with folks? And so we'll just take a minute and invite you to share some comments or responses to this question? Do we have any comments coming in?
I don't see any yet.
Okay. All right, we will keep moving then.
Okay. Oh, maybe. Oh, there it goes. It just needs a pause there. Let me see. So maybe just can we? This is my greatest fear on Zoom, when it's like there's no one's listening or no one's responding.
Right.
Can you post a question again, Valerie? About
Sure. Can you picture these opportunities in terms of looking at cultural opportunities inside of the helping relationship? When we talk about exploring someone's cultural identity, bringing that into the conversation around strengths and resources, can you picture using these opportunities in your experience with clients?
One person has stated, I work with veterans, and by discussing culture, it often brings up other stressors that would not have been discussed.
Excellent contribution. Yeah.
Thanks, Becky.
Okay. All right. Okay, let's keep going.
I'm a minority, so cultural diversity and racial identity matters. I know what it is like to be oppressed. I know the feeling. Asking what are some of the things that have helped you most during difficult times? Let's see. I think your examples help me reflect on my comments and how I care and interest, how comments I make out of care and interest may be offensive. Thank you for sharing that, Daniel. That's very honest. And that's great. That's good. Exploring family role expectations. That's critical too. Bringing in the difference of my racial background with that of my clients. Yes. Being able to communicate in your primary language. And it looks like we're good.
Okay. Thank you so much for fielding this. Okay. We're going to shift a little bit here. This is really a model that is used mostly in social work and human services practice, but really takes us away from the developmental model, sort of the linear process, to really something that makes sense in terms of us beginning anew in our culturally grounded practice with each person or each setting or each community or each family. So this just adds a few other pieces to it. This comes from a source that's called Diversity, Oppression, and Change, Culturally Grounded Social Work. It's used in a lot of social work graduate programs, but really coming from the place of, and I'm just going to start us in the middle, awareness, sensitivity, competence, and then being culturally grounded, which is that cultural humility piece of really beginning with culture in mind, however the client defines it and is able to explore it in the context of the helping relationship. So we just wanted to give this to you as a resource. We're going to move to the last piece here, which is a significant theory that has been used primarily in the last few years, that is based on international research and also research with U.S. communities, coming from a faculty at Northeastern Illinois University in Loyola. So I want to tribute the faculty that came up with this source book. We use this at Zacharias Center as a guidebook for a lot of the folks that we work with. The title is called Models for Practice with Immigrants and Refugees, Collaboration, Cultural Awareness, and Integrative Theory. So this is a focus on transnational practice, which encompasses a variety of different roles, from case management, counselor, educator, facilitator in various settings, and really looks at, similar to the Geneva Gay theory, the multi-directional and multi-dimensional nature of the connections that we have with communities throughout the world in terms of people's legacies that they bring into the relationships with us, but also how they're impacted and how they identify themselves today. Okay, so the main tenets of this model are collaboration, cultural humility, self-determination, solidarity, intersectionality, and post-colonial perspectives. So we're going to address some of these a little bit more in depth than others, but really wanted you to have this sort of as a framework for entering this. Okay. And Freedom and I will take turns with these different pieces. So the foundations of the integrative transnational model, the collaboration piece, and I included folks that are educators in this also in our preparation, since I know that there are educators in this program with us this morning, but working in collaboration with, so as a partner with. And this takes away the hierarchy as much as we can, or the power and privilege in that helping or teaching relationship, but it also gives responsibility to the participant as well, so that we are not the ones fixing or rescuing or coming up with the answer. So it really levels the playing field from the beginning and looks at it as a partnership.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Freedom.
No, I'm agreeing with you. It's finding a solution together, and that really establishes a level of trust in the relationship. And then I think, you know, it also, it speaks to the cultural humility piece, in that you're not forcing someone to be prescribed to a certain way of thinking. You know, that term actually, transnational identity, right, is that this multiplicity of connection and identities to different places, versus international, meaning an allegiance to one specific place or another.
Right, right.
Yeah.
There's some really incredible, I would say, TED Talks that we can add to the resources. There's one that's called, Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, Ask Me Where I'm Local. And it really just talks about the differences in identity based on people's hometowns, to places where they've, you know, found their roots and then needed to move to another place. And we might have a lot of places where we consider ourselves local, but we might have a different national identity somewhere else. So there's a lot of fodder for this kind of conversation, in terms of really just understanding that identity has to come from the inside out, in terms of how people, you know, perceive themselves and their you know, their transnational experience. The cultural humility piece, again, it will be a repeat at this point, but really acknowledge that we don't need to know and learn in order to be, acknowledge what we do not know and need to learn in order to be useful for helping other people. So really coming from a tutorial stance, if you will, in terms of learning with the person that we're serving. Which is different than not doing our homework in terms of understanding various cultural communities, but just really looking at it as a journey that we are taking with that person. The self-determination piece we spoke to before, when we talked about the importance of using that cultural humility in the goal-setting process with people that we're working with. And so really understanding that people know what's best for themselves. We know that self-determination as a value came out of the social work practice when we were making a lot of mistakes and causing harm to Native American communities in the 1960s and 70s around deciding what was going to be best for those communities and what families needed to do and how children needed to be educated. And we made a lot of mistakes at that time, which really rooted us in this value in social work and other helping professions.
Right. I'd like to speak to that as well too. Our family first coming as refugees from Southeast Asia, and the agencies that were resettling us when we first arrived to Chicago said that we needed to move to Minnesota in order to be, you know, have more access to resources, better schooling, you know, more space, and essentially it was a state intervention to tell us that they think this was what was best for us. And I think that, you know, as a person who is receiving these services, you know, you have to also say, I'm grateful for all the work all the resources you're providing, but also we know what's best for our own lives. And Minnesota snow is not the best for refugees who've come from a tropical climate.
Thank you, Freedom.
Yeah.
Okay, the next area of the integrative transnational model is solidarity. And for many of us, we think of solidarity as being part of a march, holding our fist up in the air. And there are so many other dimensions to this. And so we're going to take turns talking with you about this. Freedom, do you want to start with this?
Sure. So walking with other and or his or her journey in a new land, social justice challenges and unjust power structures, the systems that are negatively impact or are vulnerable to the oppressed. So as we keep in mind like what it means to act in solidarity, also being able to step back and being able to help someone embrace their identity is a part of solidarity, is a part of activism. I think a lot of the times when we think about activism, it means loud. It also means stepping up. The louder you are, the bigger you are, the more the heard you are. And that's a very westernized idea. I think part of it also, we need to incorporate some of these other pieces. And so the importance of human relationships when we engage people as partners in our services that we deliver. And then thinking about the implications for the different groups that we serve as well too, these communities, our immigrant refugee communities, and people of color.
I'm going to move to the next slide. So, Freedom, if you want to start, go ahead. And then
sure. So unfortunately, the video that we wanted to share was not, the audio doesn't work. But I'm going to share it here. Hopefully you can get that. It's a video of Tim Wise and Angela Davis talking about allyship. So this is the piece where we're talking about intercultural humility and activism that we can look at within your own roles. Right. So what can solidarity look like? Having the courage to challenge assumptions, right? Being able to actively state observations that are in a bias or service delivery. You're aware of oppressive systems of power. You have the courage and commitment to grow and challenge oppressive systems. And then your awareness of your own privilege, right? But a big part of being able to be an ally, actively be an activist and an ally, is to knowing when to step up to advocate, and then also knowing when to step back. And in this particular political environment, it is more important for you as an ally to step back and listen than it is for you to step forward. And that's my opinion right now. Being able to use our social position and our power to challenge some of the previous kinds of thinking, the people around us and our practices, and even also advocating for policy change within our own organization or structure. Essentially acting in solidarity and allyship is a vehicle for change for your organization, as well as building relationships for your clients.
Yeah, thank you. And as we were looking at this together, we were coming up with a lot of examples of our own experiences, some successful, some painful, some that we're still involved with in terms of shining the light on, policies and procedures in organizations, but also supporting colleagues of ours that, like from my own experience, don't have the same social position that I might have sitting in a room. So my role is to create space, make space, get out of the space, so that my colleagues have an opportunity to be able to share their voice and knowledge and resources. And then my role is really to support them. So I'm thinking of a couple examples right now. People I would not name here, but so much as, being an ally is like, what can I do to support you? How do you want me to be in this meeting with you? I'm with you in this goal of moving this project forward. What role would you like me to take, if any? But coming from that place of not centering myself in my position and in my cultural identity in that situation without the partnership of the other person. So those are examples of this.
I'm gonna name people because no, I'm just kidding. I'm gonna name my own family. I think sometimes the people who are closest to us are actually the hardest ones to challenge on some of these pieces. So educating and informing members of our own community. So how do we come to a place where we're comfortable enough to challenge some of these ideas that people who are close to us within our own community, right? There was a show several years back. It was called 30 Days, and I shared this with Valerie in the past too. Essentially, young man from Iowa who's, I believe, from a Catholic family, very anti-LGBT. And essentially for 30 days lived in the Castro district of San Francisco and the gay community there. And his roommate was also gay. And by the end of the 30 days, they were leaving at the airport. He was in tears because he missed his friend. They built this relationship. But what changed in him, this person from Iowa, was how he became an ally to the LGBT community, was that he spoke to someone who was also straight and very religious. And that person's daughter, who came out as gay, said that I love my daughter so much, I cannot, abandon my relationship with her, and therefore I have to support her. And that's what changed his mind. So the power of working, educating, and informing people within your own community is critical to building allyship.
Absolutely. And a lot of the racial justice dialogues that Z Center has been involved in, as well as partnering with other organizations, there's this sense of loss that comes with challenging people in your own community and then having those relationships be strained, right? But there's also this sense of, if I'm not able to speak, stand my ground, live my values, what are the strengths of these relationships? And I know there's been a lot of grief and loss around people in my own community of colleagues that have gone to challenge neighbors and friends and family members in a different way over the past months than before, and experience the power of using their own voice, but also experience the loss of when those relationships don't come full circle in terms of understanding.
And then also as a practitioner, as a case manager, as a therapist, this is inherent, right? Our listening, right? And I think it's so powerful right now in this particular social political environment. We want to say that we are not racist, we are not sexist, we are not all of these different things that are oppressive. But it's more important for you to prove it by saying, I'm here to listen. I'm ready to listen to you. Please speak to me.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move forward. Okay, so this is the media that we would like to share with you that you can see on your own time. So you have this here and also in our list of resources. A couple more tenets of this model, and then we really want to hear from you at the end of the time today. Intersectionality that we spoke about before is another piece of this model, and really looks at the layers of our identity factors, but also the experiences that we have inside systems where sometimes our cultural identity makes us an insider, sometimes it makes us an outsider. Outsiders don't generally, both of those experiences are problematic. In terms of an insider status, missing the connections and the contributions from people that are deemed outsiders, as well as outsider status, experiencing micro-invalidations and exclusion. So again, just drawing attention to this model, and we did provide additional resources for it. This is an example, and these are commonly found this is the title of this is Fabric of Oppression and Impacted Groups, and really just looks at, from an intersectional standpoint, the dominant category on the top and then a marginalized category on the bottom. This is a very limited image that just addresses a few dimensions of diversity, but this gives you an example. When we looked at the video earlier about the lanes, merging lanes and intersectionality, where some people might live with being perceived as able-bodied and they're a person of color. Some people might be a white male, but also gay, so feeling like there are ins and outs in terms of access to resources and acceptance and privilege. Anything that you want to say about this, Freedom?
No, sorry. Just reading a question here. Yes, we can. The link is actually going to be included I think I put it into the chat box as well, but I'm not sure if it's not accessing correctly.
The Tim Wise link is also on the resources page.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything you want to add to this?
No.
Okay, let's keep going then. Okay, so another piece of the transnational model is including post-colonial perspectives. And so I'm imagining that we all have a different background level of information about neocolonialism and post-colonial experiences. So really understanding the consequences, primarily with communities of color. Certainly there have been other groups in the Middle East and other areas that have been experienced the push factor of being removed or having their communities or countries dominated by other. So this perspective integrates post-colonialism with perspectives of social justice and self-determination. And it also looks at communities, again, looking at the legacy of communities of color. So this particular picture is an experience that I had in Nicaragua, where there were different lands that were used for farming, and there were practices by the ownership of the country, of the company, which was from another country, bringing in practices that used pesticides, harmed workers, and then when workers started to be harmed and their production was lower, they left. And these are the workers left in that farming area without resources. So these workers were exploited through a multinational company that came into their area to create profit. That is one example of many examples of colonialism. Do you want to add in here, Freedom?
Yeah, I think it's important as practitioners to think about your roles as agents of change, and think about how both strategically you can work with other people within your organizations to build in initiatives that will create change and serve as a vehicle for change in the work that you do.
And post-colonial perspectives don't have to exist primarily outside of the United States. There are many experiences inside of the United States with First Nations, with folks that have traveled up from Central America into the West Coast area that are being impacted by some of these same practices that exploit labor and then also remove power from, you know, people's hometowns that they've been raised in, lived in, which causes them then to migrate to other areas. And so some of this is more of the sum, I think, of what we have been talking about, coming from a cultural humility standpoint. I'm going to invite both of us to contribute, of course, to this section. But the personal context and the experience of transnational individuals, families, communities, really comes down to our ability to honor these different areas. So certainly honoring people's resiliency, honoring people's use of spirituality or religion or faith, honor people's need to change their way of using spirituality or religion of faith in the migration experience or in the asylee experience, looking at people's cultural values and the dynamic sizing, what is most significant inside of that cultural identity that impacts people. And looking at the experience of migration, whether it's what you've shared, Freedom, in terms of your experience, witnessing the courage of your mother and your own experience as a refugee family, but also the experiences of if there's trauma, if there's loss, what needed to happen, what did the family have to adjust to adapt to make that experience happen. So really exploring that. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think bringing value to all of those experiences kind of levels that playing field when working with someone in need. Again, it develops that sense of trust and the framework to be able to kind of share things that you may not be able to if you didn't practice kind of a cultural humility and in your service delivery.
Yeah. And then really conceptualizing health and mental health based on cultural background, faith background, access to resources. For some families, physical health is the most important, and mental health is not something that's dialogued about or discussed or addressed. For others, mental health is addressed inside of the family or inside of a faith community and not outside. So really not looking at these things in a polarizing way, but what is the conceptualization of health, of mental health from the individual that you're working with, and what do they see as relevant resources for that?
Right. Also not politicizing any of the experiences that your clients may be bringing with them that you might politically disagree with too. So again, that speaks to the valuing of who they are and all the dimensions of who they are when they come and see you. Yeah.
I think, Freedom, that's been a particular challenge for a lot of practitioners lately when there is so much politicizing and so much polarization of having clients and families come into our services that might be in a very different place than we are individually as practitioners around racial justice oppression, around responses to a pandemic. So I think that we've had to hold a lot of complexity lately in terms of that cultural humility piece.
Right. Yeah. It's important for us to remember that, politics is just one lens of looking at an issue.
And I don't know that either of us would have said that 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. So client self-determination we've talked about, and again, is a practice that begins again with each new relationship, and role expectations. Many of us have been educated and trained to have a primary role in our relationships with folks, and when we take it into the lens of cultural humility, it's really about being of service and finding out from that client or that individual what is going to be most useful to them. So a psychotherapist might need to turn into a case manager, a counselor might need to turn into an advocate, or we might need to turn into resource finders in a given day based on what's most useful. Do you want to add into this piece, Freedom?
No.
Okay. All right. Okay, we're almost finished here, and then again, we want to hear from you towards the end. Again, honoring the complexity of the person's experience, and you're going to see some of this just being reiterated from earlier parts in the training this morning. So again, looking at intergenerational experiences, loss from refugee and immigrant experiences, also looking at acculturative stress. One of the questions that was asked is how to respond and support younger people when the generation above them is coming from a very different cultural context. And I know that, Freedom, your response of finding mentors, groups, people that are culturally connected to the community as resources is one
representation.
way. Yeah, absolutely. And then also understanding the impact of trauma. And for many people, it is not a choice. For most people, it's not a choice. This whole concept of the American dream and all of that good stuff really was about seeking education, freedom, religious freedom. We're in a really different place right now in terms of different waves of immigration. And there is, the push factor of being forced to migrate. It's not something that people are making a choice to do, as was represented to us in the 1700s and 1800s. So do you want to add anything to that?
You've covered it beautifully. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So this is a recap, and I'm going to invite Freedom to chime in here on this, the recap for the transnational model.
So examining kind of our core commitments to clients and self-determination. So I'll speak to this. I think it's, so many kind of neoliberal, neo-colonial programs that have come out this effort to say, we know best. There's a push for, you should be college educated. You should have, these resources. And we forget to, we essentially undermine our clients or the people that we work with, the populations we work with, by not asking, is this what you really want? Are these the skill sets you want to develop? Or is this the area you want to go into? So again, moving away from that idea that we know best. And more so, let's talk to each other and work out together what we can do. A belief in social justice. Do you want to speak to this, Valerie?
Sure. We'll take turns now at this point. Yeah. Okay. And I think that this language shortchanges it a little bit. Not only a belief in social justice, but a participation in social justice, because we can study social justice and current issues, but what is our participation? How do we use ourselves as advocates, as allies, as listeners, as supporters, when there are, pressing and impactful racial and social justice issues? And this exists on the individual as well as the organizational level. And then the next piece is a readiness to adapt Western theory, so adapt from Western theory to fully respond to the needs of the person or family. From the question before, we're not throwing out Western theory, Western medicine. We're not throwing out US culture in the ways that we've been socialized. What we're doing is expanding this to make sure that it's not exclusive and that it's more relevant to people that are coming from various cultural communities and experiences of oppression. Do you want to chime in?
I actually have to step away for 1 minute. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm going to keep going then. Okay, so the next piece of this is honoring the perspectives in history, migration patterns, and lived experiences. And if there's a few things that you keep in mind from this time this morning is the lived experience phrase, is really honoring lived experiences, which connects us to empathy, connects us to our heart, connects us to listening in a different way than like studying and learning. So the lived experiences phrase is particularly important. And then the next area is developing culturally sensitive, collaborative, affirming, and respectful relationships. I would imagine most of us came into the roles that we have now because we want to be of service, and yet the ways that we're trained sometimes helps us to start a relationship from a one-up perspective. So really changing that perspective and entering into partnerships. Then the other pieces here are looking at cultural imperatives, listening to what is most significant, upholding cultural imperatives to bridge and connect, especially working with immigrants and refugees, and then aligning our work with social change and understanding social issues, as well as being aware of the needs for culturally and relevant and culturally sensitive and relevant services. And I feel like we've addressed that by giving you different models of what that could involve. And then this is the shorter list of best practices, and this can be used in a variety of settings, whether in a case management, educator, therapist, counselor, advocate role. And this is hopefully a very large review for you, and I'm imagining that we already come from this place. So whether we're working in a psychiatric setting or in a community center, not to categorize, but to use our clients' terms. And then explain the purpose for why we're asking questions. The assessment stage of the helping process can be very intimidating, and it can really be detrimental if we're not using it as a trust building process for people. So to really ask why we're asking for information, be willing to explain things that are on an intake form and how that might be useful for us to learn about that in order to serve the person, and really to create that as have that be a transparent process. The next setting is partnering. We talked about partnership and collaboration. Managing our curiosity. New helpers and seasoned helpers all can make blunders sometimes when we ask questions because we're learning, we're fascinated. It's an area that we don't know that much about. But given what we shared with you before, that when we continue to question something about the client that's not relevant to us providing services, we other that client or we make that an issue. So asking questions that they're not bringing to us as the most significant reason for seeking help would be an example for that. And then again, on an organizational level, all of us are responsible for our individual practice as well as looking at the impact of organizational practices and policies on our service delivery and on ourselves. I know Zacharias Center is immersed in dialogue, discussion, and change as an organization to make sure that we are walking our talk in terms of racial justice and social justice perspectives that impact each other as coworkers, that impact our relationships with the community, and then of course our relationships with folks that we serve. So really looking at this in a multi-system way. Do you want to add anything to this, Freedom?
Yeah, I think several mistakes that I've made as working in social services is one system I had for a database for a client that came in, the first name was spelled FNU, and then the student's surname. And so I went out to the waiting area and I said Fanu, and I didn't realize that FNU within our own system meant first name unknown. So this particular person was from Papua New Guinea and did not have a first name. It was their surname. So everyone listening, don't make that mistake. FNU means first name unknown. but simply also just on an intake form, go through it. I encourage you to go through, if you use an intake form, beginning, why are you asking those questions, and if they are needed, and continually to kind of reassess those things, because simply asking for a social security number does have implications, especially for someone who might be undocumented. It already kind of reinvigorates stress and anxiety within them, and may feel like they can't get any services there and walk out of your space.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So again, we've covered so many things, but we really want to draw attention to how coming from a space of cultural humility gives us new perspectives, and helps us to see what we might see as social issues or problems in a different way. So we can learn with our clients what constitutes positive community health. We can learn about perspectives of mental health and illness. We can learn about lived experiences, but also personal definitions of what constitutes poverty and homelessness. I know for some of us that have traveled to different places around the United States or internationally, we might have a perspective or a line on what constitutes poverty. I have extended family that live in rural communities. If I was traveling through without understanding their lives and experiences, I would be like, wow, these people don't have. And they are feeling very rich in their own lives, very rich with family connections, very rich with opportunities. So just really looking at these different areas from a humility lens is important. We can also look at this in response to folks that we work with different abilities. And we can also look at it, and I think this is a whole training in itself, is, in our roles and relationships with folks, what is the difference between charity in terms of what we provide to folks to help impact their lives, and then coming from a social justice standpoint in terms of using values such as empowerment and collaboration and solidarity and humility in our relationships with them. Freedom, do you want to add to this at all?
Yeah, I think it's important to share that your perceived deficit of a community is damaging in itself. So make sure that you stop yourself and think about it, and before you verbally communicate how you feel about something, that if it's coming from a place of cultural humility.
Thank you. Okay, so this is where we would like to hear from you. And we have about 10 minutes left or so, but we'd like to really hear your contributions and ideas by using the chat feature. So a couple of the questions that we've put together is, are you open to treating others as expert on their own lives? So that's a leading question. And then, are you willing to use intervention models focused on cultural humility? Did this time this morning help you to increase your understanding of options for that? And then the third question is, are you willing to intentionally create safe and brave spaces for people? And the terms safe space and brave space are different from each other. It's not really for us to decide what is safe for somebody else, but to create a space where they can be brave and take risks and use their growing trust with us to make things happen in their lives. So we're just going to ask you to take a minute and respond to some of these, any of them that you would like, in the chat feature, and then we'll share out what we've received.
Ellie, are you able to see the chats at all?
I'm not. I can try again.
Yeah, just click on the all panelists and attendees in the chat section.
Okay.
It's a drop-down menu.
Yep. Are you able to see it?
I am. I'm hoping you'll be able to see it too, so you can chime in.
I know. I only see one, the recent question. I'm sorry.
Okay. Person wrote, honoring is critically needed in a relationship. Another person wrote, perhaps it is not, are you willing, but how will you? Another person wrote, I am open to hearing the person's voice.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
I found some now.
Okay, good.
So
Thanks.
I can help you out here. Go ahead and finish the one that you're on. Yes, I believe.
people are experts in their own lives, and then it went down. So many are coming in quickly now. So
Yeah. I believe people treating others as experts is very empowering and honoring. I'm happy you talked about the work it takes to create a safe space. I feel like this is a new concept to define spaces and workshops, and I've always felt that tons of work goes into truly creating that space. You cannot just define it. Yes, I want to create safe space for my students, and have learned today how to be more understanding and culturally sensitive. That's from Cameron. Let's see, by asking questions and expressing interest to learn more. Do you want me to keep going?
let's keep going as much as we can. This is the end, right?
Yes, we can never be experts in another's life. We must center all of our engagement around our clients. Thank you. What if evidence-based practices counter a family's cultural beliefs? For example, spanking and corporal punishment. How do you create a safe space? Ooh, that's a good one at the end. Freedom. Should we kind of form a response to that and share it out afterwards?
Sure, I think that's the best thing. We want to respect everyone's time. We're approaching 12:06, so.
But that's an excellent question. Yes, treating others as experts on their own lives aligns with my person-centered approach. I also feel more empowered to apply intervention models in my work. And then, yes, of course, I'm doing all these things, especially during these times. I do and will continue to keep educating others and creating a safe space for people to speak openly. Thank you for this excellent presentation. I will share this with our staff. Appreciate your examples. Look forward to resources and podcasts. I do believe I'm open to treating others. It's also finding balance when you have systemic issues that can impact case management service plans. I think that's a really significant point.
Podcast. Are we starting a podcast?
Yes, we are. I don't know. Maybe I missed the memo. Yeah. Yes, to begin, I plan on speaking with my team about how to review and present the questions that we are asked during the intake process. Thank you. I love the concept of microaggressions. This is a social work value. As a social work, this was very valuable to me. People need to feel safe before they will let you know how to help them, and I will actively seek ways to help my clients feel safe. I believe that I can never be an expert in someone else's life. They know what they need more than I, even if it's not the choice I would make. I think that's really important. Thank you so much for this beautifully done presentation. Great reminders to reflect on the action steps. I love the creating a safe and brave space. Clients are the experts. Yes, thank you. This is really good. Many takeaways, especially the section on intersectionality and Geneva Gay's work. Let's see. Thank you for your generosity of all of these comments. Thanks for the info, very positive and reaffirming, many, many insights. And we will continue to collect these.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for all the great work that you do and your willingness to sit through 3 hours of our presentation.
Yeah, we have another couple of slides that we do want to share with you. If I can. It's not transferring at this point. We just wanted to, let's see. Okay. These are also insights that we were hoping that, can you see this?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
Yes.
These are other insights that we were hoping that you would come away with, and I feel like you have from all of your comments. Our own learning process, our blind spots, looking at community services as partners, focusing on creating brave spaces. And this is a quote that we wanted to share with you at the end from someone who's passed on that is known across the United States as a diversity trainer. And again, you will have access to all of this in the materials on the website. And then we also wanted to share this with you. We really thank you for participating with us in this training and knowing that this is the beginning of ongoing learning for all of us. So the last picture we shared with you is our wish for you is to be at peace amidst the storms.
I want to, first of all, more than anything else, thank Valerie, thank Freedom for an absolutely wonderful and amazing presentation. I have literally a notepad full of notes. And I know I'm excited to bring some of these ideas back and kind of have the kind of conversations we need to have. I also want to thank this wonderful partnership with Zachariah. So just a couple of other pieces of business. Just wanted to remind you all that you will be receiving an email with the evaluation. It'll be connected to your registration, and you know, you put the name on it that you exactly how you expect to see it to show up on the certificate, and we'll get those out to you as soon as possible. It might take a week or two, but we'll get them out to you as soon as we can by email. And then we will also notify you as soon as we get the video posted. And if there's any other resources, I'll communicate with Valerie and Freedom about posting any additional resources, and we'll try to keep in touch with you on that. With that said, I want to thank all of you again for attending, and I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you, and take care.
Thank you.